The sun rose over the sleepy Florida town like a golden promise. By 8 o'clock, the streets were buzzing with whispers and footsteps, neighbors filing into the white-steepled church that crowned the hill. Its bell tolled slowly, solemnly, calling the faithful to witness not just a union, but what many believed was a miracle: David Miller's second chance at love. David, at 53, had the weathered look of a man who had carried too much loneliness on his shoulders. His broad frame strained against the fitted navy suit he'd dusted off for the occasion, and though his hair was streaked with silver, his blue eyes still carried a flicker of hope, almost boyish. He stepped out of the black sedan, squinting into the Florida sunlight, and for the first time in years, he smiled. "Morning, Dave," a voice called from across the churchyard. It was Tom Whitaker, an old friend who'd known him since high school. Tom hurried over, his tie askew, his brow damp with the humidity. "You sure about this, Dave?" Tom asked under his breath, leaning close. "Folks are talking." David adjusted his tie and gave a dry chuckle. "They always talk, Tom. Let them. I've been alone too long. She gives me hope." Tom studied him, searching his face. "She's young, Dave. Half your age. You're not worried." David's smile softened, almost wistful. "Maybe that's the point. She sees me not as the man I was, but as the man I could still be." Tom shook his head, muttering something about stubborn fools in love, but David was already walking toward the church doors, his steps steady, his chest lifted. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, wood polish, and anticipation. White ribbons adorned every pew. Stained glass windows bathed the congregation in colors of emerald and crimson. Conversations hushed as David entered, nodding politely at familiar faces. And then came the hush of reverence as the organ swelled. Every head turned toward the back, where Angela appeared. She was 25, radiant in lace and satin, her veil catching the sunlight like spun silver. Her smile trembled with both joy and nerves, her hazel eyes shimmering as she walked down the aisle. Even the skeptical whispers faded in that moment. Whatever gossip had clung to her, about her mysterious past, about the gap in age, was silenced by the sheer glow of her presence. "She's so young," a woman whispered to her neighbor, "but maybe she'll bring him back to life." Angela's steps were graceful but unhurried, as though she wanted to savor every heartbeat. David's chest tightened as he watched her approach, his hand outstretched. For a moment, the loneliness of decades fell away. He wasn't the man abandoned years ago, or the widower who ate dinners in silence. He was a groom again, a man chosen, a man loved. When her hand finally touched his, David felt something he hadn't dared feel in years: salvation. They stood together at the altar, before Father Collins, who raised his hands over them. "Today we gather to witness the sacred union of David Miller and Angela Hart," the priest intoned. His voice was deep, carrying through the rafters. A covenant of love, in the eyes of God and his people. David glanced at Angela. She squeezed his hand, her lips curving in a shy smile. There was something in her expression, vulnerability mixed with fierce devotion, that nearly brought him to tears. As Father Collins began reading from Corinthians, David's mind wandered. He thought of the years wasted in silence, of empty holidays, of nights staring at old photographs. He thought of the day he first met Angela at the county fair, when she'd caught him sitting alone at a picnic table, pretending to enjoy a corn dog. "You look lonely in this crowd," she had said, sliding onto the bench beside him. "Maybe I've just been waiting for someone to notice," he'd replied. That was the spark. From that simple exchange, their lives had intertwined, and now here they were, standing before God. David returned to the present as the priest asked, "Do you, David Miller, take Angela Hart to be your lawfully wedded wife?" David's throat tightened. "I do," he whispered, his voice breaking with sincerity. "And do you, Angela Hart, take David Miller?" The words were cut short by the sudden swing of the heavy oak doors. A gust of hot air swept into the church, rattling the ribbons, stirring the veils. Every head turned, but David didn't see who entered. Not yet. His gaze was locked on Angela, whose smile flickered, whose fingers trembled in his grip. For now, though, the moment still belonged to them. The bells had rung. The vows were nearly spoken. Hope filled the air like incense. And yet, somewhere deep in the marrow of the morning, fate was shifting, waiting to strike. As the church doors stood open behind them, a memory pressed against David's mind. Uninvited, heavy, like a ghost refusing to stay buried. He had been here before, not in this church, but in another sanctuary decades earlier. A younger man then, full of dreams and plans, standing at another altar with his first wife, Melissa. He had loved her with the same certainty, the same trembling faith. But that marriage had ended in bitterness, and worse, in loss. Melissa had walked away one stormy night, carrying with her not only their marriage, but also the newborn son David never had the chance to know. The boy was whisked away into a new life, into the arms of strangers, while David remained empty-handed. For years, he tried to track them down. Phone calls, private investigators, desperate prayers, but Melissa made sure he never found them. In time, the trail grew cold. So David buried his grief under work, under silence, under a hard shell that no one could penetrate. That kind of loneliness changes a man. It wears grooves into his soul, leaves him staring too long at empty chairs across dinner tables, listening too hard to the hum of refrigerators at night. By the time David hit his 40s, people in town whispered he'd grow old alone. Some said he'd lost his faith, others that he was cursed. He became a fixture of the diner on Main Street, the man who sat in the corner booth with black coffee and an old newspaper, nodding but never joining in. And then, Angela. It was the county fair, 3 summers ago. David had gone out of habit, not hope. He bought a corn dog, wandered through the flashing lights and country music, and sat at a picnic table tucked off to the side. He felt the familiar cloak of invisibility wrap around him. Families bustled by, couples held hands, teenagers laughed too loud. Nobody noticed him. Nobody ever did. Until she did. "You look lonely in this crowd," a soft voice said. David looked up, startled. A young woman stood across from him, holding a lemonade, her auburn hair catching the light of the Ferris wheel. She smiled as if she'd known him all her life. "Maybe I've just been waiting for someone to notice," he'd answered without thinking, the words tumbling out before he could retreat behind his usual silence. She slid onto the bench, uninvited yet welcome. They talked until the fair closed, about nothing and everything. The weather, books she liked, the music he used to play on his old guitar. She was 22 then, vibrant, curious, and strangely comfortable around a man twice her age. Over the weeks that followed, they crossed paths again, at the grocery store, at church, at the gas station. Each time, her smile disarmed him, and each time, he found himself saying more than he planned. Soon it was dinners at his kitchen table, laughter echoing off walls that hadn't heard joy in years. Still, there was mystery. Angela never spoke much about her past. She brushed off questions about her family with vague answers. "It's complicated," she'd say, then steer the conversation back to lighter topics. David, hungry for companionship, let the shadows remain unchallenged. Love, or the hope of it, can make a man blind. To him, Angela was salvation. She gave him back birthdays with candles, Christmas mornings with coffee and laughter, walks along the beach at dusk. She looked at him not as a lonely widower or a forgotten man, but as someone worthy of attention, of affection. He felt reborn. And yet, even in those tender moments, David sometimes caught a flicker in her eyes, like she was carrying a weight she could never set down. He told himself it was just the pain of a difficult childhood, scars she didn't want to reopen. He promised her silently that he would never press her, never force her to reveal what hurt her. "Everyone has a past," he once told her as they sat on his porch, fireflies blinking in the humid summer air. "What matters is who we are now. And right now, I want you with me." She leaned against him, whispering, "Then that's enough." It should have been enough. But in truth, the past was not gone. It was waiting in the dark, patient as a predator, waiting for this very day, for this very altar. And as the organ swelled inside the church, as Angela's hand trembled in his, David could not have known that the very love he believed had saved him would soon reveal itself as the cruelest deception of his life. The organ swelled, filling the rafters with a hymn of promise. Stained glass poured ribbons of light across the sanctuary floor, turning the white gown and navy suit into living mosaics. Father Collins stood with the Bible open in his hands, his voice steady and reverent. "Marriage," he declared, "is a sacred covenant. It binds two souls not just before men, but before God himself." David barely heard the words. His gaze was locked on Angela's trembling smile. Her fingers were warm but unsteady in his, her pulse fluttering beneath her skin. He thought it was nerves. He thought it was the awe of the moment. He leaned closer, whispering, "You're safe. You're mine." Angela's eyes flickered, almost pained. But before David could search her expression, the world shifted. Outside the church, Margaret Lane clutched her worn leather purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. The Florida sun beat down on her silver hair, but she hardly noticed. For weeks, she had prayed for strength, begged God for clarity. And now, on this morning of white ribbons and ringing bells, she stood trembling at the edge of the steps, her heart pounding like a drum. She had watched David Miller grow from a young husband into a lonely widower. She had pitied him, even admired his endurance through decades of solitude. And when she first saw Angela by his side, radiant, hopeful, devoted, she had almost allowed herself to believe it was a miracle. Almost. But Margaret knew better. She had known the secret for too long. She had held it like a burning coal inside her chest. Angela was not Angela at all. She was Andrew, the baby Melissa had carried away, the child David had lost. Margaret had seen that baby years ago, and she had recognized the eyes, the jawline, the faint trace of David in Angela's smile. For nights, she had lain awake, listening to the clock tick, asking herself whether silence was kinder than truth. If she spoke, she would destroy him. If she stayed quiet, he would walk blindly into sin so deep no scripture could wash it clean. Her lips quivered as she whispered to herself, "Lord, give me the strength, or forgive me if I fail." From inside the sanctuary came the rising swell of the organ, the murmur of vows about to be spoken. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She could not let those words finish. Tears streaked her cheeks as she reached for the doors, her frail hands trembling. "God help me," she whispered. And then she pushed them open. The heavy oak doors slammed open with a groan that echoed through the church like thunder. A gust of hot Florida air swept in, rattling ribbons and tugging at veils. Heads turned. Conversations died. At the doorway stood a woman, stooped, thin, her face lined like cracked porcelain. Her gray hair clung to her temples in the heat. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather purse, pressed to her chest, as if it contained her last breath of strength. Her voice trembled at first, then rang out with startling force. "Stop this wedding." The congregation gasped. Father Collins lowered the Bible, his brow furrowed. David turned, confusion cutting across his face. The woman staggered forward, each step echoing against the marble floor. Her eyes locked on Angela, wide with grief, with fear, with fury. "She's not who you think she is," the woman cried. "You can't marry her. You can't." Angela's breath hitched, her grip on David's hand tightening until her knuckles blanched. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not here, not now." David's heart lurched. "Angela, what is this?" His voice was sharp, threaded with panic. The woman pointed a trembling finger at the bride. "Her name isn't Angela. Not really. She is Andrew, your son, David. Your blood. Your child." The words cracked the air like lightning. The sanctuary erupted. Gasps turned into horrified murmurs. Some clutched their children, shielding their eyes. Others covered their mouths, as if they could push the words back inside. The organist's hands froze on the keys, leaving the silence deafening. David stood frozen, staring at the woman, then at Angela, whose tears streamed silently down her face. His mind rebelled, refusing to connect the dots. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "No, that's impossible. This is madness." But the woman pressed on, her voice breaking. "You had a son, David. Years ago. Melissa took him from you, gave him up. I was there. I watched him grow. I saw him struggle. And now, God help us all, now he stands here, hidden beneath a veil, and you mean to take him as your wife." Angela shook her head violently, sobbing. "I didn't know. Not at first. I swear I didn't know." David's knees weakened. The church floor seemed to tilt beneath him. "Tell me she's lying," he begged, gripping Angela's arms. "Tell me this is some cruel trick." Angela's lips quivered. "I only found out months ago. I wanted to tell you. I tried. But I couldn't lose you, David. You're the only good thing I've ever had. Lose me." His voice cracked into a roar. "You should have told me the truth." The congregation watched in stunned silence. A man near the back whispered, "Dear God, he was going to marry his own blood." Father Collins stepped forward, his face pale. "David, Angela, This is not the place. We must end this now. God does not bless lies. But David's world was already crumbling. He felt the weight of every empty year, every prayer unanswered, every night he'd stared at the ceiling longing for family. And now, cruelly, that family stood inches away from him, dressed in white, hiding behind a new name. He staggered back, releasing Angela's hands. His chest heaved, his vision blurred. Rage and grief coiled together, a storm he could not contain. "You let me believe," he hissed. "You let me believe in us." Angela reached for him, desperation in her voice. "I loved you, David. I still love you." Her words hit him like a blade. Love twisted into something grotesque, something unbearable. The pews creaked as people shifted uneasily, some rushing for the doors, unable to watch any longer. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fear, pity, disgust. Someone shouted, "Call the sheriff." David's hand twitched at his side. Inside his jacket pocket, cold steel pressed against his ribs. He had carried the revolver for years, a relic of caution in a dangerous world. He had never fired it in anger. Until now, he hadn't known what anger truly was. "David," Father Collins warned, his voice tight. "You must breathe. You must let God handle this." But David's faith had shattered. God had abandoned him once before. And now, standing beneath the stained glass, beneath the crucifix itself, David felt that abandonment again. He reached into his jacket. Gasps rippled through the pews as the black revolver glinted in the colored light. "David, no." Angela screamed, reaching for him. His eyes burned with tears, his voice breaking as he raised the gun. "You were my salvation and my curse." The trigger clicked, the shot thundered, and the sacred silence of God's house was ripped apart by violence. Angela collapsed at the foot of the altar, her white dress blooming red against the stone floor. Screams pierced the sanctuary. Mothers clutched their children. Men dove for cover. The woman who had spoken the truth shrieked, her frail body crumpling against a pew. David dropped the gun, his hands trembling, his chest heaving as if he had torn his own heart from his body. He stumbled forward, kneeling beside Angela, his hands stained crimson as he shook her lifeless shoulders. "No, no, no," he sobbed. "Forgive me, God. Forgive me." But there was no forgiveness in the church that morning. Only horror, only silence, only the weight of a secret that had poisoned everything it touched. Outside, sirens wailed, racing up the hill toward the white-steepled church that would never again be seen as holy. The echo of the gunshots still hung in the rafters, reverberating like thunder trapped inside the sanctuary. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel, mingling with the scent of gunpowder and candle wax. Then chaos erupted. Screams tore through the church. Women clutched their children, shielding their faces as if the stained glass might shatter around them. Men scrambled from the pews, shoving toward the doors, their footsteps pounding against the marble floor. The organist stumbled back from the bench, his hands pressed over his ears as if to block out what could never be unheard. Angela's body lay sprawled at the foot of the altar, the lace of her gown blooming red, her chest still, her eyes frozen wide in shock. The veil that had floated so delicately down the aisle just minutes earlier now clung to the sticky floor like a shroud. David stood over her, trembling. His revolver clattered from his hand, skidding across the aisle before coming to rest beneath a pew. He dropped to his knees, pulling Angela's lifeless form into his arms, rocking her like a father might a child. "No, no, no." His voice cracked, hoarse and broken. "I didn't mean, God help me, I didn't mean." The woman who had shouted the truth, the one who had stopped the ceremony, collapsed against a pew, weeping into her wrinkled hands. "It was never supposed to end like this," she moaned. "Lord, forgive us all." Father Collins stood frozen at the altar, his Bible still open in his hands. His voice shook as he cried, "Everyone, leave the church. Go now." His command scattered the remaining parishioners, who rushed for the exits, the double doors slamming against the walls as sunlight poured in like judgment itself. But David couldn't move. He pressed his face into Angela's hair, the tears spilling hot down his cheeks, mixing with the blood on her veil. His mind reeled, fragments of the woman she had been flashing before his eyes, her laughter at the county fair, the way she leaned on his porch railing during summer sunsets, the soft way she whispered his name. And now, she was gone. Gone by his own hand. "You lied to me." he whispered into the silence of her skin. You were my child. You were my bride. You were everything. And I killed you. The sanctuary was nearly empty now, save for the priest, the grieving old woman, and the lifeless bride. The silence was broken only by David's ragged sobs. Then came the pounding of boots on the church steps. The wail of sirens grew louder, filling the air with dread. Police stormed through the doors, weapons raised, their shouts cutting through the sacred space. Drop to the ground. Hands where we can see them. David looked up, his face streaked with tears, his hands coated in blood. For a fleeting moment, he considered reaching for the gun. Not to fight. No, never to fight. But to end it, to silence the torment raging in his chest. His hand twitched, hovering over Angela's body. Don't. An officer barked, his finger taut on the trigger. Step away now. David's strength drained from him. His shoulders slumped, his hand fell limp. He lowered himself to the ground beside Angela, stretching his arms out wide in surrender. His voice was a whisper. Take me to hell. Two officers rushed forward, pinning his arms behind his back, snapping the cuffs around his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, but David barely noticed. His gaze never left Angela's still face as they hauled him to his feet. Sir, you're under arrest for murder, an officer recited, but the words were drowned beneath the roar in David's head. She was my salvation and my sin. As he was dragged down the aisle, the stained glass above seemed to mock him. Christ's painted eyes watched from the crucifix, unblinking, solemn. David wanted to scream at the heavens, to demand why the truth had waited until now, why it had chosen this moment to destroy him. But no words came, only silence. Outside, a crowd had gathered on the church lawn, neighbors and strangers alike, their faces pale with disbelief. Mothers held crying children. Old men shook their heads in despair. Some crossed themselves, others spat curses. There he is, someone muttered. The man who killed his own bride. His own blood. David hung his head as the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car. The sun was merciless overhead, burning down on the steeple, on the blood-soaked steps, on the whispers that would haunt this town forever. Father Collins emerged from the church, his face gray with sorrow. He whispered a prayer, but even his words seemed hollow. The white church, once a place of hope, now looked like a mausoleum. Inside, the altar still bore the stain of the morning's violence. The flowers wilted in the heat, their petals drooping in defeat. And at the center of it all, the blood of a secret no one could forgive. As the squad car pulled away, David pressed his forehead against the window, his tears smearing across the glass. The church bell tolled once more, not for celebration, but for mourning. And in that moment, as the town watched their neighbor taken away in chains, a single truth echoed in every heart. What had begun as a wedding of hope had collapsed into a tragedy no prayer could erase. The back seat of the squad car was hot, suffocating. David's hands were cuffed tight behind him, the metal cutting into his wrists. His face was pressed against the window, streaked with tears and sweat, as the church shrank in the distance. He could still see the white steeple piercing the sky, still hear the echo of screams. He closed his eyes, but Angela's face was there, pale, bloodied, eyes frozen wide. He let out a broken laugh that turned into a sob. Hours ago, he had been a groom. Now he was nothing but a killer. The officer driving the car glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. You got anything to say for yourself, Miller? David swallowed hard, his throat raw. She was my son, he whispered. My son. And I married her. God forgive me, I married my own blood. The officer's eyes flickered, uncomfortable, but he said nothing. Beside him, the younger deputy shifted uneasily. Sick bastard, the deputy muttered under his breath. David jerked upright, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare, he rasped. Don't you dare call me that. I didn't know. I didn't know until today. His chest heaved, his face contorted in grief. I loved her. Do you understand? She was all I had. The deputy turned away, shaking his head. Tell it to the judge. The rest of the ride was silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and David's ragged breaths. When they arrived at the sheriff's station, cameras were already waiting. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions, shoving microphones through the barricade. David, did you know she was your child? Why did you shoot her in the church? Do you feel any remorse? Flashes lit up the humid air as David was dragged from the car. His cuffs gleamed in the afternoon sun. He tried to shield his face, but there was no hiding. The town would forever remember him not as the lonely widower who found love again, but as the man who shot his bride at God's altar. Inside, the station buzzed with activity. Detectives whispered over files. Phones rang off the hook. Everyone wanted answers, but no one could make sense of the tragedy. They shoved David into an interrogation room. Bare walls, metal table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor. A single camera blinked red from the corner. Detective Harris entered, a seasoned man with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. He tossed a file onto the table and sat across from David. "You know why you're here," Harris said flatly. David lifted his bloodstained hands, still cuffed. "Because I killed her," he whispered. "Because I killed my own child." Harris leaned forward, his tone sharp. "You shot a young woman in front of a church full of witnesses. But I need to know why. Was it rage? Was it shame? Or were you hiding something darker?" David's eyes burned. "You think I wanted this?" His voice cracked, raw with anguish. "I wanted a wife. A partner. I wanted a chance at happiness after years of nothing. And then," he broke off, choking on the words. "And then God ripped the floor out from under me. Told me the woman I loved was my son. What man could survive that?" Harris studied him, his expression unreadable. "So you pulled a gun." "I didn't know what else to do," David sobbed. "I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was like the devil was inside me, screaming. One second I was looking at her face. The next, she was gone." The detective sat back, silent for a long moment. "Well, that's something the jury will have to decide, whether it was madness or murder." Hours later, they led David to a holding cell. The iron door clanged shut behind him, the sound final, merciless. He sat on the hard bench, his head in his hands. Outside, voices echoed down the corridor, the hum of the world continuing without him. In the silence of his cage, David whispered into the darkness. "Angela, Andrew, whoever you were. I'm sorry." His voice broke. "I loved you, and I destroyed you." The words hung heavy in the air, unanswered, as the man who once stood at God's altar now sat behind steel bars, the line between groom and killer forever erased. The courthouse in downtown Jacksonville had seen its share of scandals. Politicians caught in lies, businessmen stealing fortunes, but nothing like this. By the time David Miller's trial began, the story had already become national news. Headlines screamed across every television screen and front page. Florida groom kills bride at altar, bride revealed to be his long-lost son. Outside the courthouse, camera crews jostled for position. Satellite vans lined the street, their antennas reaching into the gray sky. Protesters and curious onlookers crowded the steps, holding signs that read, "Justice for Angela," and "Sin before God." Some came to mourn, some to condemn, some just to witness history. Inside, the air was heavy, every bench packed with townspeople who had once celebrated David's supposed rebirth into love. Now they leaned forward, eyes fixed on the man at the center of the storm. David entered in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles. His once proud frame sagged under the weight of shame. His silver hair was unkempt, his face drawn and pale. He kept his eyes on the floor, unable to meet the stares that burned into him. At the prosecutor's table sat Assistant State Attorney Karen Doyle, a sharp-featured woman with eyes like steel. She wasted no time in painting David as a monster. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began in her opening statement, her voice calm but cutting. "This is not simply a story of love gone wrong. This is a story of deception, of rage, and of murder committed in cold blood at the altar of God. The defendant, David Miller, shot a young woman, his own flesh and blood, in front of a church full of witnesses. He pulled that trigger not out of confusion, but out of choice." Her words rippled through the courtroom. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably. David's attorney, a weary public defender named Mark Ellis, rose slowly when it was his turn. His tone was different, measured, almost pleading. "This case," Ellis said, "is about a man who was blindsided by the cruelest revelation imaginable. David Miller lived decades believing his child was lost to him. That wound never healed. Then fate brought someone into his life who gave him hope, companionship, love. He did not know until the very day of his wedding that the woman he loved was also the child he lost. When that truth was thrown at him, in front of God and an entire town, he broke. His mind fractured. This was not premeditated murder. It was a tragedy born of unbearable shock. The battle lines were drawn. The prosecution called its first witness, Father Collins. The priest stepped solemnly to the stand, his hands clasped tight, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Father Collins," Doyle asked, "tell us what happened inside your church that day." The priest's voice trembled. "We were in the middle of the vows when the doors opened. A woman entered, and she revealed the truth. That Angela was not Angela. That she was Andrew, David's son. And what did the defendant do? He looked at her. At Angela. He asked if it was true. And when she wept, when she confessed, he pulled the gun. Right there, in front of God's altar. And he shot her." The courtroom stirred with murmurs, jurors glancing at one another. "Thank you, Father," Doyle said. No further questions. Defense attorney Ellis rose. "Father, you've known Mr. Miller many years?" "Yes." "Would you describe him as violent?" The priest shook his head. "Never. He was lonely, but gentle. This was unlike him." Ellis nodded, seizing on the point. "So it is possible, in your opinion, that Mr. Miller acted not out of cold calculation, but out of a sudden, uncontrollable break?" Father Collins hesitated, his eyes on David. "Yes, that is possible." As Father Collins stepped down from the witness stand, his hands trembled so violently he had to grip the rail to steady himself. The courtroom air was heavy with judgment, but the priest carried a different weight, one that pressed against his very faith. He had baptized David's first child decades ago, before Melissa vanished. He remembered David as a young husband, proud and hopeful, bringing that baby boy to the font with tears of joy in his eyes. And now, all these years later, the boy had returned under a new name, a new face, only to die at the very altar Collins had sworn to keep holy. Inside him, a storm brewed. How could the house of God become a place of blood? How could his own sanctuary, the walls where he had preached forgiveness, become the stage for a revelation so cruel it shattered 2 lives in a single breath? In the pews, parishioners glanced at him with pity, but Collins felt none for himself. He felt guilt. Guilt for not recognizing Angela sooner, for not asking harder questions when he sensed her unease. Guilt for standing helpless as David raised the gun. He sat back down slowly, folding his hands, whispering a prayer no one could hear. "Lord, forgive me. Forgive this town. Forgive the sins that hid in silence until it was too late." For the first time in his ministry, Father Collins wondered if faith was enough to hold together a community so broken. And as the trial pressed on, he realized he wasn't only a witness to David's crime. He was a witness to the collapse of his own belief in the safety of God's house. Next came the old woman who had stopped the wedding, the one who had carried the secret for too long. Her name was Margaret Lane. She leaned heavily on a cane as she made her way to the stand. Her voice quavered as she recounted the story, how she had known of Melissa's decision to give up the baby, how she recognized Angela years later, how she could not stay silent when she saw David walking toward disaster. "I thought I was saving them both," she wept. "I never dreamed it would end in blood." "Why wait until that moment?" the prosecutor demanded. "Because I didn't know how to tell him. How do you tell a man his bride is his son? I thought," her voice broke, "I thought God would give me the right words at the right time." The jury listened in stunned silence. Some shook their heads. Others looked down, unable to meet her grief. The prosecution closed with the medical examiner's report, cold facts about the bullet's path, about how Angela died instantly, about the crimson stain left on holy ground. Then it was the defense's turn. Mark Ellis put David himself on the stand, a risky move, but his only chance. Shackled and trembling, David spoke through tears. "I loved her," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't know she was my child. When the truth came out, I felt the world collapse. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't myself. One moment, I was ready to vow my life to her. The next, I was told she was my son. What man could survive that?" The courtroom was silent, every ear straining to hear him. "I wish I had dropped to my knees and prayed," David continued. "I wish I had run out into the street and screamed. But instead, I pulled that gun. And now she's gone forever. I destroyed the only light I had left. I will never forgive myself." His words cracked the jury's composure. Some dabbed at their eyes. Others stared at him with pity mixed with revulsion. In her closing, Prosecutor Doyle was relentless. "Tragedy does not excuse murder. Pain does not excuse pulling a trigger. The defendant had a choice, and he chose to end a life. The defense countered with desperation. This was not a monster. This was a broken man caught in a nightmare. He deserves justice, yes, but not the rest of his life behind bars. The jury filed out to deliberate. Hours ticked by. The crowd outside swelled, waiting for a verdict. Finally, the foreman returned, a folded slip in his hand. The judge's gavel brought the room to silence. On the charge of first-degree murder, the clerk read, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. David closed his eyes, tears carving rivers down his face. His lips moved silently. "Forgive me." The trial was over, but the shame would linger forever. The gavel struck once, hard enough to rattle the glasses of water on the attorney's table. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled, then fell to silence as Judge Eleanor Price, a woman with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, fixed her eyes on the man standing before her. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice steady, "you have been found guilty of murder in the first degree." David stood shackled between two deputies, his shoulders slumped, his face pale as parchment. His hands shook uncontrollably, but he did not fight. He looked like a man already serving a life sentence in his own mind. The judge continued, her tone heavy with both authority and sorrow. What was meant to be a sacred ceremony in the house of God became a scene of horror. A community was scarred. A family secret, buried for decades, was revealed in the worst way imaginable. And an innocent life was taken. Karen Doyle, the prosecutor, sat straight-backed, her lips pressed in a thin line of victory. Defense attorney Mark Ellis rubbed his temples, defeated. The jury members shifted in their seats, some still pale from what they had heard. The judge turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the packed gallery. "I have presided over many tragedies in my years on this bench, but rarely one so tangled in deception, silence, and despair. Secrets," she said, pausing as her words sank in, "do not disappear. They fester, and when they are finally revealed, they destroy everything in their path." The weight of her words pressed down on everyone in the room. David lifted his head slowly, his eyes red, hollow. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Your Honor, I never meant to hurt her. I loved her, more than I can explain. And when I found out who she was, I couldn't breathe. I wasn't myself. I don't expect forgiveness, not from God, not from this town. But please know I would give my own life to undo what I did." The courtroom was still. Even those who despised him couldn't look away from the broken man before them. Judge Price's voice softened, but only slightly. "Mr. Miller, remorse may weigh on your soul for the rest of your days. But justice demands that you answer for the choice you made. You had a gun. You had a moment to walk away. And instead, you fired." She lifted the sentencing document. The entire room held its breath. "David Miller, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The words struck like a hammer. Gasps rose from the benches. A woman in the back sobbed quietly. Margaret Lane, the frail woman who had revealed the truth at the wedding, clutched her cane, her shoulders shaking. David swayed as if the ground had been pulled from beneath him. His knees buckled, and the deputies caught him before he collapsed entirely. His lips moved, barely a whisper. "Angela. Andrew, forgive me." The bailiff called for order as the gallery erupted, some crying, some nodding with grim satisfaction, others whispering prayers under their breath. The sound of chains echoed as the deputies pulled David back to his feet. Judge Price struck her gavel once more. "Court is adjourned." As the crowd began to shuffle out, the prosecutor gathered her files, her expression firm but unreadable. Ellis leaned toward David briefly. "I tried, Dave," he muttered. "God help you." David was led toward the exit, the orange of his prison jumpsuit glaring under the courtroom lights. He did not fight, did not protest. His eyes were fixed forward, vacant, as though he had already left the world behind. Outside, the press swarmed, ready to report the final chapter of the trial. But inside, the courtroom still buzzed with the echoes of what had just been said, what had just been sealed forever. And in the silence that followed, one truth lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed it. A wedding meant to celebrate life and love had ended in death, shame, and a sentence that would follow David Miller until his last breath. In the days that followed the verdict, Jacksonville buzzed with arguments that refused to die down. In diners, on porches, in barbershops and church basements, the town split itself down the middle. Some saw David Miller as nothing but a murderer. He pulled the trigger, one man said over coffee, shaking his head. Doesn't matter what he found out, you don't kill in God's house. He'll rot in prison, and that's justice. But others whispered with a different tone, pity, not scorn. He was lied to his whole life. An elderly woman told her neighbor. He lost his son once when Melissa left him, and then he lost him again the moment he found out the truth. What man could survive that without breaking? At town hall meetings, tempers flared. Younger voices demanded harsher punishment, calling David a monster who had desecrated sacred vows. Older residents shook their heads, insisting he was a broken man caught in a storm too cruel for any soul to weather. The local paper filled its letters to the editor page with angry scrawls and trembling confessions. Some urged the church to reopen its doors, to reclaim the sanctuary from shame. Others declared the building should be torn down, its foundation salted, so the stain would never haunt the hill again. The community could not agree. What they did agree on, however, was this: nothing would ever be the same. The name David Miller had become both a warning and a lament, spoken with equal parts disgust and sorrow. And as the argument swirled, one question lingered in every home, every pew, every whispered prayer. Was David Miller a monster who chose violence, or a man destroyed by truths too heavy for any heart to carry? The courthouse steps were nearly empty by nightfall. Reporters packed up their cameras, their headlines already written, their voices still echoing on the evening news. The crowd had dispersed, but the whispers lingered in every corner of town. Jacksonville would never forget the day a wedding became a funeral. The church on the hill, once a beacon of white purity against the Florida sky, now stood as a monument to shame. Its doors were locked. Its pews sat empty, draped in dust and silence. Some said they could still smell the gunpowder when they passed by. Others swore they heard echoes of that single gunshot whenever the bell tolled. Parishioners who once gathered there now drove to the next town over for Sunday service. To many, the sanctuary was no longer holy, it was cursed. Angela's grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Flowers wilted and were replaced, week after week, as neighbors who had once whispered about her age and her secrets now whispered prayers for her soul. On her headstone, the name read Angela Hart Miller. But beneath, etched faintly by a grieving hand, was another word: Andrew. Children asked their parents why the church was closed. Parents struggled for words. How do you explain to a child that love and blood had collided in such a terrible way? Some called it a tragedy of fate. Others called it a punishment from God. No one could agree, but everyone carried the weight. Margaret Lane, the woman who had revealed the truth, withdrew from public life. She rarely left her home, her blinds drawn, her voice trembling when spoken to. I thought I was saving them, she told a neighbor once. Instead, I damned them both. Her words became a ghost that followed her to her last days. Inside the prison walls, David Miller became a shell of the man he once was. Fellow inmates whispered his story in hushed tones, how he had married his own child without knowing, how he had pulled the trigger in a church. Some mocked him, others pitied him, but no one truly spoke to him. He ate in silence, walked in silence, prayed in silence. In letters to the court that never made headlines, David begged for nothing. No appeal, no second chance. Only one thing: that Angela, Andrew, would be remembered not for the horror, but for the life cut short. She was light, he wrote. Whatever else she was light. But memory is not kind. The town remembered the blood on white lace, the wail of sirens, the sight of a groom led away in chains. Years later, when newcomers asked about the shuttered church on the hill, locals told the story in hushed tones. They spoke of the bride who walked the aisle only to fall at the altar. They spoke of the groom who discovered the truth too late, and the gunshot that ended everything. Some told it as a warning about secrets, others as proof that sin cannot hide. But all agreed on one thing: the stain would never wash away. On the church's steps, a single wreath sometimes appeared, placed by hands unseen. White roses, tied with a ribbon. On the ribbon, in handwriting no one recognized, were always the same words: love built on lies cannot stand. May God have mercy on their souls. And so the town carried on, scarred but breathing, haunted but alive. Yet every toll of the bell, every whisper of the wind across the hill, reminded them of what had been lost that day: a bride, a son, a father, a future. The eternal stain was not just on the church floor, not just in prison records or court transcripts. It was etched into the very soul of the community, a story too shocking to fade, too heavy to forgive. And in the silence of the Florida nights, when the air grew still and the steeple cast its shadow under the moon, the people swore they could hear it, the echo of vows never finished, of a truth revealed too late, and of a single gunshot that silenced love forever.